So assisted dying, Kamal, we did do a special about this. We spoke to Esther Ranson because we were anticipating this legislation being brought to Parliament. Now it has, by Kim Leadbeater, who is the sister of the late Jo Cox, took over her seat following her tragic death. And now, I mean, this is something that's been rumbling on and on and on. It's been debated before whether we should actually put this into law. Now that's looking like it might become a reality. It's going to be debated for 6 weeks, but with a Labour Party with the majority it has, and I think most people on that side of the House in favour, does look like this is probably going to come to fruition, doesn't it?
A much bigger chance of that happening than last time it was voted on in 2015. Certainly the public polling suggests that 2/3 of voters support a change in the law. And for those who are what you might describe as actively against, that's about 1 in 10. As part of that assisted dying special that we did, we interviewed the Labour peer, Lord Faulkner of Thoroton, who's long fought for a change in the law. And he's been talking about this bill, this fresh attempt, 9 years after 2015, to make assisted dying legal. And he did say that this was far more likely to be passed. He said that from talking to a lot of MPs in the new Parliament since the general election, he said that my sense is that support for it is very, very much stronger among MPs than it was in 2015. 477 of the 650 MPs who were there then have now gone. It's a radically different House of Commons. The government itself, although Keir Starmer has said in the past that he is very sympathetic to the arguments, this is what is called a free vote, a vote of conscience. And so there'll be no direction from the government. So ministers, whether that's in cabinet or in the more general government, have been asked to stay neutral on this issue. I think there are, we're going to get into the arguments in a second. I just think there are sort of 6 areas for me which are the most interesting for discussion. There's the sort of faith and morality part of it, the issue around for disabled people, a lot of disabled people today coming out and saying this is the start of something that would be very dangerous, particularly for disabled people. The slippery slope argument, once you've started, it just becomes more and more easy for people to take their lives. Palliative care, the problem with end-of-life care not being supported enough. And also it changes the role of doctors. Doctors will be one of the key people to decide whether someone should go through with assisted dying or be supported. How does that change the relationship between us and the medical sector, who are there to save people's lives, not to end people's lives?
Let's have a look at the nitty-gritty of the bill and what it's actually proposing. So the bill will limit the option to die with assistance to people with a diagnosis of a terminal illness, excluding those in, quotes, unbearable suffering for other reasons. So it's likely to be limited to those with 6 to 12 months to live. That needs to be confirmed by a judge and 2 doctors. They would have to agree that terminally ill patients can be helped to end their lives. The safeguards in the bill are designed to be stronger than those in a similar bill, as you said, put forward by Lord Faulkner back in 2015. So the person who wants an assisted death will need to be mentally competent to make the decision, given more than one opportunity to reaffirm that it is their settled view, given time to reconsider and be aware of the implications and alternatives. So that does seem to provide some safeguards just against your slippery slope argument. I think people on one hand are looking at terminally ill people in a huge amount of pain with no prospect of survival or recovery and saying to themselves, we must treat humans as we would animals, and we can put down animals who are in such a desperate state that they have no quality of life whatsoever. But then equally, and we've discussed it before, I worry about the slippery slope thing, that it suddenly becomes something that people are using if they've got mental health problems, that people feel that they're a burden on their families and therefore opt for assisted dying. That it can somehow, you have this piece of legislation now, and what's to stop it being tweaked in the future? It does seem to be something that's become more popular now as we've become a more secularised society, that the one voice of opposition to this morning is the Archbishop of Canterbury, as you'd probably expect, Kamal. So of your points there, you talked about the religious argument. He's written a piece for the Daily Mail, which is headlined, "I don't want the people I love or anyone to choose to die because they feel they're a burden." And it's quite a compelling piece here by the most senior clergyman in the land, basically talking about his mother dying at the ripe old age of 93, but when she was receiving palliative care because she had cancer, she turned around and said, "I'm a burden, I'm becoming a burden." And he's saying that if that legislation was in place, would his mother opt to die when actually they didn't feel she was a burden at all, and they were quite happy to nurse her through those final very, very difficult weeks and days.
Our producer Lillian caught up with Kim Leadbeater this morning. They've been, many people have gathered outside Parliament to discuss this, both pro and against this new bill. Let's hear what Kim Leadbeater had to say.
Kim Leadbeater, thank you so much for speaking to the Daily Tea. You've said this morning that passing this bill is a moral obligation for MPs. Why is that?
Look, I've had lots of conversations with families who have lost loved ones under very, very harrowing circumstances. And what those conversations have proved to me is that the law as it stands is not fit for purpose. At the moment, we've got people who are terminally ill taking their own lives, feeling that the only choice they've got is to go to another country to have an assisted death, which they often do prematurely, missing out on precious last weeks and months. It costs an awful lot of money, so there's a huge inequity there as well. Most people can't afford to do that. You've got people who are having harrowing, traumatic deaths, because sometimes even the best palliative care cannot ease their pain and suffering. And there is a conversation to be had about palliative care, and I will do everything I can to campaign for the best possible palliative care for everybody. But if, for example, as a woman I met recently who's got stage 4 terminal breast cancer, which is spread all over her body, she's allergic to opioids. She's not going to be able to have medication to ease her suffering. She wants to have an assisted death at a time of her choosing with her loved ones around her. And I believe she has the right to have that choice. This subject hasn't been voted on in Parliament for nearly a decade. The time is right for the debate. The time is right to listen to those stories which show very clear evidence that the law is not fit for purpose. And as legislators, I do believe we've got a moral duty and an obligation to change things.
What do you say to medical professionals who say they actually have a moral obligation to protect life, and that this might encourage them to actually end lives, and that doesn't sit right with them?
Look, I think we have to put trust and faith in our medical professionals. I had a meeting with the BMA this week to talk about what things are like within their sector, and their voices are really important in this. And there is absolutely a duty of healthcare professionals to protect life, but there's also a duty to make sure people don't suffer. And I think it's really important that their voices are part of this conversation. We've got doctors making really serious decisions literally day in and day out and doing a brilliant job. And I think as long as they're part of this conversation and their views are heard and respected, then we will get this right, but we will give people the choice that they deserve at the end of their life.
You mentioned palliative care. The head of the UK's leading palliative care organisation, the Association for Palliative Medicine, has said to the Telegraph that he's surprised you haven't consulted with him on this bill. Is that something you plan to do?
Absolutely. I mean, it's quite interesting. I saw that and I thought, well, I don't believe you've been in touch with me about it. And lots of organisations have been in touch with me about it, so I'd be very happy to meet with them. They are a really important part of this equation. I had a meeting with the 2 hospices in my local area this week, and I said, look, your voices need to be heard. We need to speak to patients, we need to speak to staff, we need to speak to that sector as a whole and look at how this bill can make sure, this isn't about as an alternative to palliative care. Palliative care needs to be brilliant, and it is brilliant in many places, so I'm very happy to speak to them.
And critics say the bill is being rushed, is it?
The concept that this is being rushed when this is a debate that's been going on for decades, 20 years at least, I find a bit bizarre, to be honest. There's been debates in Parliament in 2024, earlier this year, in Westminster Hall. There's a debate in 2022, inundated with people coming in. It's a live debate, it's a live discussion, but it's been going on for a very long time. And I would urge colleagues and I would urge members of the public to have a look at those debates, have a look at the range of views and opinions that there are. We've also now got 31 jurisdictions around the world who have got a form of assisted dying. So my job is to learn from the best practice and also stay away from what I think is not the right practice, and looking at those models to making sure that we get this right. And where you do get it right from the outset, cases in Australia, cases in Oregon, then the criteria do not budge. We get it right from the start, then I'm very confident that the law will do the job that we need it to do.
And do you think that's how we avoid things like a slippery slope where people who are towards the end of their life or have terminal conditions feel pressured to go through with assisted dying?
Yeah, I do, absolutely. This has got to be about choice, and it's got to be about laying out the range of options that are available to somebody, and we've got to get that absolutely right. But what it isn't about, and this is the other thing to be clear about, it's not about old people, it's not about disabled people, it's about people who are already dying. And the best expression someone said to me was, it's not about ending life, it's about shortening death. And I believe that people should have the right to do that in a way of their choosing, to give them the autonomy, to give them the dignity. And public mood is saying that that's what most people think. Most polls are saying 75%, 80% of people say that the law needs to change. So getting the strict criteria in place, proper safeguards, proper protections, being really clear this is about terminally ill people. If we get that right, I think this could be a really pivotal moment in time.
And just finally, most people would agree that the NHS is in a difficult state at the moment. Do you think this is the right time to bring this bill, given that end-of-life care is probably not what it should be in the UK now?
Look, let's have the conversation about end-of-life care. Let's have the conversation about the NHS. I'm hugely optimistic and hopeful now. We've got Wes Streeting heading up our health team in Parliament. This government is serious about fixing the problems in the NHS, fixing any issues that there are around palliative care. But all the time that's happening, we've got people taking their own lives, we've got people having harrowing deaths, and they deserve the right to choose to do things differently. And that isn't about what the NHS looks like, it's about their personal autonomy and their personal choice. And once you've had those conversations, it makes it very clear to me that that is the focus of this issue and that is the focus of this bill.
Kim Leadbeater, thank you so much.
So that was Kim Leadbeater there on Parliament Square. Also there with her were campaigners for assisted suicide like Sarah Fenton, whose husband Keith died at Dignitas, that's the assisted dying clinic in Switzerland, in 2017.
I'm here today because my husband Keith went to Switzerland to end his life in 2017. He wanted control of his death, and I promised him when we were there that I would join the campaign. That was 7 years ago. That is when I joined the campaign to get the law changed in this country, and today is a monumentous occasion for the campaign, with Kim Leadbeater's bill being introduced into Parliament.
Can you tell me a little bit more about Keith? What did it mean to him to be able to have the option of assisted dying?
So Keith was determined. He wanted choice over his death. He'd seen his father, brother and sister all die of Huntington's disease, and he knew what the end would be. He wouldn't be able to do anything for himself. He would have to rely on others. He was a very proud man and found it incredibly hard to ask anybody to do anything for him. And he didn't want to. When he got to the stage that little bits of his life he was losing control of, he said, the time's right, I need to go. And he went before he needed to, because he didn't want to miss the opportunity to travel. Yeah.
And of course the law in the UK at the moment means that it's not always possible for loved ones to go with their family members or spouses when they go to Dignitas or for assisted dying abroad. How did you went with him, didn't you? And how did you make that decision? Was it a difficult decision for you, or scary, knowing that it could get you in legal trouble?
It wasn't a difficult decision, because we were determined as a family to do the last loving thing we could for him. We wanted to support him, but it was scary because we didn't know when we came back if we were going to be arrested at the airport. I didn't know if a week later someone would knock on the door. Luckily that didn't happen, but that makes me slightly cross as well, because Keith had all that worry, that added worry. Not only was he facing his death, but he was worried for us coming home, what would happen to us. And all I could say to him was, don't worry about me, I will be fine. But, in my eyes, it was him doing the brave thing, not me.
And can you tell me about that moment that you promised him that you would campaign for assisted dying? Was that something that he asked for, or did that come from you and your family?
That came from me. We were having a discussion the night before he died, which ironically was on the 29th of November 2017, which is when the second bill's coming, so I'm hoping it's an omen. We were having a conversation and I said, you don't have to go through with it, you can come home if you want to. We'd bought a plane ticket for him in case he changed his mind, but we knew he wouldn't. And he said, no, it's the right decision for me. This is what I want, but it's wrong. I have to come to Switzerland. So then I said, well, when I get home, I'm going to join the campaign to get the law changed in this country.
And just finally, what do you say to people who are worried that this bill could lead to a slippery slope? You know, we hear examples, for example, in Canada, the Telegraph reported on it recently where a woman went in for medical treatment for cancer and she was offered assisted dying. Does that worry you at all?
That doesn't worry me at all. Canada's law is for Canadian people. We are not looking at a law like that. We are basing ours strictly on terminally ill people who have 6 months to live, who are mentally competent adults. The Health and Select Committee held a review, a 14 months review looking into assisted dying, and they found no evidence in countries where assisted dying was available of any slippery slope. There wasn't any widening of the criteria. We hope to follow the Oregon law, which is worked successfully for 25 years. It would be rigorously overlooked medically and judicially so that there could be no coercion.
Kim Leadbeater has made this clear that she believes this is a moral issue. Well, as you say, I was with Robert Jenrick this morning. He was talking about the economy, and we're going to go into that a little later in this podcast. But I did ask him specifically about this new assisted dying bill.
I'll go to Kamal Ahmed from The Telegraph.
Thanks, Robert. Today, the private member's bill to make assisted dying legal has been laid before the House. You've made your position clear on it. Kim Leadbeater, the MP who has laid the bill, has said that on this issue of assisted dying legalisation, I think we've got a duty and a moral obligation to change the law. Does that suggest that people who are arguing from your side of the fence are immoral? And I wondered how you responded to that.
Well, I think this is a profound change that will affect our country and everyone in it for generations to come. And so the number one objective is to get this right and not to rush it. And I worry that that is exactly what's happening right now. We need to learn from what's happened in other countries around the world, like Canada, for example. And I've been to Canada and spoken to ministers there who have been involved in this decision. And I would argue that a well-intentioned change there has led to some very significant, unexpected adverse consequences. So I am a skeptic of changing the law. I understand where the motivation comes from. We all do. One of the defining experiences of my childhood was having my own grandmother live with me and my family for many years, living through a very debilitating and ultimately terminal illness. And so I understand why people might want to do this, but we have to get it right and not just rush into something that might ensure that we live to regret it. So I would urge the Labour government to think carefully about this, to provide the time that's necessary to consult, for Parliament to properly scrutinise it, and to think carefully about the precedents in other parts of the world, which at the moment lead me to the conclusion that I would vote against him.
It's such an emotional argument. In a funny kind of way, there's no right or wrong, is there?
No.
But you do have to vote as if it is right or wrong. You hear the passion of people who support assisted dying, and you hear people like Robert Jenrick, who has been through, obviously, family trauma and can see why some people might want to end their life, but still believes himself, still says he feels very sceptical about a change in the law. One very strong point I thought Robert Jenrick made, and this comes to an interview that we did with Wes Streeting on our assisted dying special. Take this step by step. Have a look at all the evidence. Wes Streeting, and I hope someone holds him to account for this, said that he wanted to throw open the doors of the Department of Health and give all the evidence to whoever wanted it on either side of the debate, so that we really understand the data. I think the data, particularly around once you start with these strict constraints that you've gone through, Camilla, is it almost automatic that you just start increasing the number of people who are able to apply for assisted dying?
I think quite a lot of Telegraph readers will sympathise with Robert Jenrick's point of view. We've had a huge amount of comments into the website in response to this story, and that's been going on for some months now, since this has sort of been retabled under Labour. Let's look at the Canadian experience, because there's one particular story that sort of demonstrates this fear about it becoming a slippery slope. A woman there who was undergoing life-saving surgery for cancer in Canada was offered assisted dying by doctors as she was about to enter the operating room. Telegraph readers, as you'd imagine, Kamal, have been contacting us in their droves to respond to this story on both sides of the argument. And many of them cite Canada, where assisted dying has been legalised since 2016. One particular anecdote probably sums up the fears over it becoming a slippery slope. There was a story about a woman who was undergoing life-saving cancer surgery in Canada being offered assisted dying by doctors literally as she was about to enter the operating table. And when we talk about slippery slope, not just in terms of the legislation sort of expanding before our eyes, but also the number of patients wanting to use assisted dying, the figures in Canada are quite stark. That programme, which is called MAID, so it's the country's medical assisted in dying programme, has risen 13-fold since its conception. So originally around 1,000 people opted to have assisted dying, and now that's up to 13,000 in 2022. And then you have concerns by doctors who have indeed written to Kim Leadbeater, fearing that people will be opting for assisted dying, and indeed doctors might be advocating assisted dying because it's cheaper than actually treating people with very complex life-limiting conditions, which is a worry in itself.
For people of faith, the way that the language has changed from suicide to assisted dying, the very fact that in Canada, it's called the MAID program, M-A-I-D, as you say, Medical Assistance in Dying. It is good that the conversation is destigmatized, but it is also someone deciding to take their own life. And what you find is that the language changes to make this a much more acceptable part of, if you're old particularly, and you're unwell or you have very complex needs, this is a straightforward almost alternative. And I just feel that we do need to have a very deep discussion, because in Canada, the increase in deaths with assisted dying, it is now the fastest growing assisted dying program, as it's been described in the world, which gives it all sorts of rather unpleasant connotations. It has sparked fears from disabled people and people with complicated needs.
And we heard, didn't we, in our assisted dying special from the peer, Tanny Gray-Thompson, the former Paralympian, who uses a wheelchair, and she expressed actually quite compelling arguments on behalf of the disabled community, saying, would people be made to feel like they were a burden? Would they be forced into opting for assisted dying, particularly when they get a bit older? That argument really struck me, actually.
And her point was much more, unless you are a disabled person, you don't know how it is you are treated by the health service or by other services. Lucy Webster, the disabled journalist, has been tweeting on X about this, saying that people simply don't understand what she calls the ableist world we live in, that people have attitudes which are anti-disabled people because there's lots and lots of discrimination. So they put that point. Just going back to the people outside Parliament today, one was a disabled woman called Nikki Kenwood. She was left unable to speak, move or breathe after she contracted the disease Guillain-Barré as a young mother. She says as she lay there, she feared her relatives would have been in favour of assisted suicide. She describes herself as an end-of-life survivor.
So what happens next? There's going to be the second reading and debate starting on November the 29th. Of course, there'll be opponents trying to talk out the bill, but a vote can be forced if more than 100 MPs back it. Well, let's which, let's be honest, Kamal, looks pretty likely. If MPs do support the bill at this stage, it would then move to a detailed scrutiny stage, with the government expected to make time for it to become law next year.